What a lonely place now, after everybody's gone. So, my name's Leah Mitaba, and I'm coming from a national platform organization called Zambia Council for Social Development. We're also a member of Forus from Southern Africa. So what I'm talking about today has to do with innovative financing for CSOs. What are the trends and what are the practices? Without belaboring the point, I think it's important for us to just look at the context that we're working in. And I know that this starts off on a bad note, negative, because I think we're talking about issues around inequality, we're talking about issues around poverty, we're talking about issues around human rights abuse, and then also, we're just talking about the high levels of inequality between the countries, but then also within the countries. Having said that narrative, I think still it's important to also mention and acknowledge that we still have some positive elements. The fact that we're having conversations such as this one across the globe, I think we have a really good representation here. I think is something that we need to celebrate amidst all these difficult narratives that are characterizing our globe today. So I think it's those aspects that we need to be looking at, even as we discuss the whole issue of financing. The other second positive aspect, I think, is because we already know what the challenges are. We already know the people that are really affected, and even the groups that are affected. We also know the people that are also in the driving seats of making the situation worse. So just having that situation well understood by different people, that's politicians, civil society, the private sector, and the citizens themselves, is another score that we have as a globe to look at. And I think these have been well articulated in Agenda 2030. We also have 2063. And then if we look also at the regional blocks, such as SADC, the ECOWAS, the COMESA, also we see that we've well articulated these issues and even the proposed solutions that we need to address for us to respond to this. And I think these are also echoed in the various United Nations conventions. I spoke earlier, I think, in a group that I was in, about the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. We speak about the processes under the Voluntary National Review process. Even the AU-EU Africa partnership itself is also another avenue where we know that we have frameworks that should be working. Now, the question that we need to answer is that having articulated those goals well, I think the SDGs are building on the Millennium Development Goals. Why is the world failing the poorest and the most vulnerable of our people? And I think a lot has to do with the aspect of financing. And this is something that we have to look at collectively and address. In researching and preparing for this, I also looked at the aspect of what kind of financing would bring around. Okay, before I get to that. Okay, yeah, so I spoke about that, the fact that we're having conversations being very good, but then also the fact that we had COVID to a great extent. It also presented an opportunity because now I think the digital space has actually accelerated in terms of growth in the past 2 years. We're able to use Zoom, which was there before, but even more now because of the COVID. So I think there are also opportunities that we see in that area. But then the question is, how do we ensure that we have better access as civil society to play our role to funding for CSOs? And I think earlier on I did allude to the fact that agreed frameworks are a great start to a great place to start from. We also have made a significant global progress, I think, through the SDGs 2063 as well as the regional protocols, as earlier said. But I think what we have now to deal with is that we're at a time when we need to walk the talk. We're only 8 years away from by the period by which we need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think if you look at the progress that we have made across the globe, you find that it's quite insignificant. If I give an example of my country where I'm coming from, just talking about, for instance, the aspect of gender equality or youth inclusion, you find that we're actually going behind. So what is the problem? I think we need to be asking questions around that. The other aspect that has been coming in, I think even in the course of this conference, there's issues of competition. That's at national level, regional, as well as international level. Even amongst ourselves as civil society organizations. But I think the time for competition is gone. The time now that we have is collaborate. How do we recognize our different and comparative advantages based on maybe our geographical location, but then also maybe ability, and then also resource-wise? How do we harness those potential avenues that we have to be able to address some of the problems that we have? And I think another opportunity that we have at the moment is the fact that now that we're only 8 years away, we have an opportunity to mobilize resources. I think I'm looking forward to a process where civil society organizations have a global campaign around holding the United Nations accountable, around holding other stakeholders that are supposed to contribute to the achievement of the SDGs accountable. Because I think 8 years is going to come so quickly, and then what do we want to record as a progress that we have made? Having said that, I think yes, I started out on a negative point of view, trying to talk about the narrative that we have, but I think there's also been some innovative approaches to financing, and I'll share about 3 examples. Through our membership to Forus, for instance, I think we're one of the organizations that participated in a Forus study that was looking at the state of local CSOs. I think that study focused on about 6 African countries. One of them was Zambia. And I think as a result of that study, we got to meet the Research Institute of Wolverhampton University. And I think that also resulted in us doing some research and development work on behalf of UNICEF, Zambia, back home where I come from. And I think that offered us an opportunity as a country to bring in resources. So I think that's another area. How do we as civil society also partner with academic institutions to be able to conduct research and then be able to bring in resources for organizations? The other one comes from Nigeria. I was speaking with a friend of mine from Nigeria, Olisen, and he was sharing that a few of their members have actually explored not-for-profit lottery to be able to mobilize domestic resources. So it's been successful. So again, as civil society organizations, how do we harness these opportunities? Either through partnerships where it's done maybe in a Western country or it's done in Africa. So I think those are some of the things that we can learn from. And at the local level also, in Zambia, we are having conversations about local level philanthropy. How do we grow that? We know that as Africans, we've usually been socialized to give within the community. So my neighbor's child is also my child. So if I find a child is hungry, I'm able to feed them. If there's a funeral in the community, it's for everybody. I think pretty much everything comes to a standstill, and I think the bereaved family is supported by the community. So a lot of resources are mobilized. The same way if there's a wedding. So how do we now formalize those ways of life that are positive in terms of like growing voluntarism, but then also harnessing resources? I think that is something that perhaps through cross-learning, African CSOs can also learn from the Western CSOs because they have formalized, I think, individual philanthropy. The other area that we look at as innovative is the issue of tax incentives. How do we bring in the private sector to ensure that they get tax incentives when they contribute to civil society work? And we're saying that just as, for instance, African CSOs, European CSOs receive funding from the EU, I think it also follows that even the African Union should also be able to support the work of civil society organization. I think even before we go away from home, what can we be able to mobilize in terms of resource-wise within the home sector, but I think these are very categorical. If you look at the governments in Africa, they are run by taxpayers' money. And right now, we have a political party bill in my country where we want to be sponsoring the affairs of political parties. We want to allocate a budget line for political party activity. So what more charity work? I think we need to also lobby through the different political frameworks such as the AU, the SADC, the ECOWAS, to be able to push that also politicians back home prioritize funding for civil society organizations. The other area, of course, is through the digital space and crowdfunding. I know that most African countries are not allowed to do crowdfunding, but then through partnerships with northern CSOs, how can we also explore this area? Finally, I think the issue of reorienting mindsets and having minds within civil society organizations that are multitasked, that are also learning is very important, because we have to innovate, we also have to adapt to the current ways of working. For instance, quite a number of people since COVID are working from home, as well. There's a mix of virtual and physical ways of working. How can we harness that opportunity to be able to do more, I think, with less resources? There's also need to strengthen networks, such as maybe, for instance, the Forest Network and many other progressive networks. There's also need for, I think, cause. Now this goes to the INGOs, it goes to the European Union, it goes to the donor countries, and then also maybe the philanthropic organizations. I think we cannot run away from the reality that different civil society organizations are at different levels. So if we're going to issue a call from Brussels under the EU, and you want organizations to compete at the same level, and then you're allowing INGOs, you're allowing local NGOs, CBOs to compete with exact expectations, it's like we are starting a race with somebody who is able to run and somebody who is in a wheelchair or not even in a wheelchair. So I think the funding mechanism for the EU needs to be revised, and I think this has to go as a strong recommendation. Different tools need to be developed to meet the needs of grassroots organizations, CBOs, because oftentimes you find that the bigger NGO is not even able to implement at local level. So I think those are things that need to go as a strong recommendation. Finally, I think both short and long-term partnerships are critical to support the work of CSOs. We've seen that the past few years, there's been a strong appetite towards project-based funding, and I think project-based funding does not sustain an organization. There's need for co-funding, there's need for longer-term investment, there's need for longer-term partnerships with civil society. The other area that I'll wind up with is the issue of social capital that we have. Sometimes it helps when you belong to a network, because then you get to interact with people, you get to share what your experiences are and the work that you're doing. So I think it sort of like builds trust, which is necessary for civil society work and resource mobilization, as well as also an opportunity for cross-learning across the different platforms and players within the civil society work. So I think those areas are really critical if we're going to record the gains that we hope to see, if we're going to contribute to the world that we want to see, if we're going to contribute towards reducing inequality, if we're also going to contribute towards seeing more young people and women represented in some of these political spaces. We were just talking, I think, in the afternoon about how patriarchy continues. And for the case of Africa, this is getting worse, because politics now is also just a way of life. It's a way of people making money. It's a way of people controlling resources and having power. So you find that they are pushing out the women, they're pushing out the young people. I was just sharing with my colleagues to say that yesterday I was reading news about how our first president, the late, his son, who is about 75 years old, has been sent to Malawi in foreign mission. And you're wondering to say, don't we have young people to go out there? So I think the space is really shrinking as well for young people and for women to participate in politics. And unfortunately, it's on the political decision-making table that most decisions are made on our behalf, and we need to have those people represented on the table if the issues are going to be addressed. I think I'll end here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.